And I think what some people have worried about is some sort of a bond vigilante attack. Like these gunslingers are going to come out of the desert, shooting up yields. But basically, I just don't see that happening. And I think fundamentally, I believe that governments will do what they need to do to avoid a collapse, to avoid a depression type scenario. And I think when you look at the, let's say, interest expense as a percent of GDP for the United States, that was around 1.5% of GDP, during the pandemic and before. And it spiked up to where it is now, 3%. So we essentially doubled our interest expense as a percent of GDP in the last few years. And as we're now going to be, over $1 trillion in interest expense a year, I just think that governments can't afford to keep paying all of this interest. And what people will say is, well, the bond market's going to decide that. Nobody can boss around the bond market. And I just don't believe that's true. I think when push comes to shove, governments can boss around the bond market. It's got to be a situation where governments have their backs truly against the wall. And I think, ironically, where people say, well, there's all this debt, that's what's going to cause the bond market to explode. I think there's all this debt, what's going to cause governments to step in and take a greater kind of control over monetary policy, whether that's closer connections between the Federal Reserve and Treasury in the United States, whether that's going to be, different changes in the way the Euro system works, because I think there's some big kind of fundamental problems with that system and the deficit to GDP caps that are there, and the fact that individual countries can't, print money based on their own needs. So I think there's going to be some turmoil, in Europe around how do we handle this situation. But ultimately, I think if the choice is, do we kind of, fixate on 2% inflation target, and do we essentially tighten, monetary conditions to a point where interest expense around the developed world just starts eating up a larger and larger portion of GDP, which I would add is actually kind of a regressive policy, where the wealthy are the ones that own fixed income instruments. They're the ones that get the interest payments. So you have about $1 trillion stimulus package every year in interest payments from the US government. 75% of that goes to the United States. 25% of it goes to our allies and adversaries that hold treasury bonds. And the 75% in the United States that get it, it's mostly the wealthy. It's people that have large mutual fund, bond fund positions. So people that have, hundreds or thousands or millions of dollars in money market accounts getting 4%. So you're getting essentially a taking of tax money from the population and redistributing it to the wealthy and to our adversaries overseas, like China, which it's just not the way that people want the system to work, especially I think the way the Trump administration wants the system to work. And I think that's why they're kind of dead set on chipping away at Federal Reserve independence, because they recognize that they've got this whole policy, this whole grand plan that they want to put into place. And it's like you've got 4 players on the basketball team running around doing all the plays the way they're supposed to. And you've got this 5th guy who says, no, I'm independent. I'm the Federal Reserve. I don't have to follow the plays or listen to the coach. And, I think that a lot of people think, oh, well, that's a big threat to markets. And, a great danger is Fed independence. And again, I just have to look at history. That just has not been proven out to be the case. There have been times when the Treasury has dominated the Federal Reserve. There have been times when in this country we've had a central bank when we haven't. This idea that we need to have an independent central bank, especially in the post gold standard era, I just don't buy it. I think Federal Reserve needs to be folded in more into the get more with the team, basically.